You sound great.
Yeah, right.
What, you telling me you weren't feeling it? You were in it.
Hello and welcome to the Somewhat Daily Movie Review. Today's movie in question is Sound of Metal, directed by Darius Marder and starring the wonderful Riz Ahmed. So I haven't seen Darius Marder's other film, I think it is, or maybe it's a short film. And for what is basically a directorial debut from this guy, this movie is really great. Like, maybe even excellent. I wanted to like the movie a bit more. Personally, I think he could have gone a bit more in depth with the story and with the character of Ruben, but I really appreciate what he did do. And it's a really well-made movie from especially the technical aspects, which is what was actually really important in this movie, because it's following a deaf guy, and you want the viewer to also feel deaf with the deaf guy, as silly as it sounds. And speaking of the deaf guy, Riz Ahmed, who I've only ever seen in Nightcrawler and Rogue One, I believe, where he's more of a supporting character, really gets to stretch out in this movie as the front and center character. He is the star character, and he really makes work of the character that is Ruben. He really gets to do emotional acting here. He cries a couple times through the movie, and those are some of the best parts. He's rageful, he's sad, he's longing, he's reminiscent, he's all these great emotions, and Riz Ahmed portrays them really well through the character. And I was kind of surprised because in Nightcrawler, which is what I kept thinking back to, he plays a pretty normal, not boring, but just a kind of generic character for the story. And I don't even remember him in Rogue One, to be honest, but he is really great in this movie, and I kind of want to see him in more starring roles, because this is really the only starring role I've seen him in. And I think Darius Marder and Riz Ahmed should definitely get back together for another movie, because he seems like a good director and he's a great actor. One thing that I really appreciate about this movie was the technical aspect, that is the sound design, as weird as it sounds and as weird as I delivered it. But the sound design in this movie is top notch. It really makes the viewer feel deaf. And I know it's a kind of generic thing to throw at the great sound design. Oh, it really makes the viewer feel this. But it really does succeed in making the viewer feel kind of disorientated, just like Ruben would in the story, especially early on. And this is another thing that the movie does really well, where it shows what Ruben is so sad for. Because when a lot of the movie is Ruben looking back at kind of the good old days, that only really works if you see how good the good old days kind of were. And in those opening 20 minutes before Ruben is deaf, and you see him dancing and cooking breakfast for his girlfriend, and you see him drumming, and you just see him in action. You really do feel for this guy as soon as he loses hearing, and as soon as you see he's splitting up, not splitting up like that, but distancing himself from his girlfriend just to go and do this House of the Deaf kind of thing. You really do feel for him, and they captured that emotion that he's constantly feeling through the movie, where he just wants to go back to that really well. But back to the sound design, sorry. The sound design is really great. You feel just as disorientated as Ruben the whole movie. The way they do it is really interesting, because they're constantly going back and forth between being basically deaf and not being deaf. You see from Ruben's perspective and from kind of behind him. And when you see from his perspective and everything's kind of just a dull like sound effect, just a thud, or just like a incoherent kind of garbling, you do feel for him, because just like a couple months ago or a couple weeks ago or even days, he could hear, and you see how desperate he is to get that hearing back. And it makes Ruben's character really sympathetic, and you really do feel for him. And even when he does a couple things that are kind of bad and mean to other people, you see where he's coming from, because he just wants that good old day kind of thing back. And not to get too locked up on it, but that is one of the reasons that the movie is as great as it is. All the other technical aspects are pretty sound as well. I do wish the cinematography was a bit more interesting, because it is pretty flat. I wish it were more stylistically appropriate, I guess. But I think Darius Marder didn't really care for that. He seems like more of a character director, which nothing wrong with that, because just the setting of most of the movie being in this kind of thick, luscious forest is a really great setting for the movie, and it really makes for some memorable scenes. I'm thinking of when it's kind of overcast and he's walking back to the group house, and it's just a beautiful blues and greens and purples, and it's just moments like that really stick out in my head, and I wish there were more moments like that. But to get into those more juicy details of the story, I'm gonna have to throw up a spoiler warning. If you haven't seen the movie, definitely go check it out. It's on Prime Video. It's absolutely worth your time. It's just over 2 hours. I want to say 2 hours 10. The movie is excellent. I'd watch it just for the sound design alone because this movie shows exactly how you should do it. But yeah, definitely go check it out. I don't want to spoil it's a pretty basic story, but I don't want to spoil it for you because some of those emotional moments in there are really effective, and I would hate to ruin that for you because I went into this movie blind and I want you to go into this movie blind. But yeah, spoilers. So the moment that really sticks out in my head, there are two moments in this movie that really stick out. It is the moment when Ruben confronts Paul Raci's character Joe about getting the surgery, and at the end of the movie when Ruben is sitting down and just experiencing the world. So with the scene with Joe, excellent acting from both sides. They managed to make a conversation between two deaf people really great because they can both still speak, they remember how to speak, and Joe can read lips. So it makes for a really great, interesting conversation between two deaf people, which is definitely not easy to do. And just the emotion. Joe acts as almost a father figure to Ruben. And when you see how heartbroken he is by the fact that he got the implant, you really do feel for Joe as like a disappointed dad. He even compares Ruben to a drug addict. He's like, you sound like an addict right now, Ruben. And you see Ruben begging for like, hey, can I stay here for like another 4 weeks? Can you give me some money to buy my van back? It's just such a great emotional scene. And especially from Paul Raci's character, where he is on the brink of tears for half the conversation. It just makes for a great kind of sending off point for Joe's character and the entire community that Ruben lives in for the middle of the film. I forgot her name, but the girl that Ruben's hanging out with and that's selling all this stuff for him is also a great character, and I only picked it up after watching it. That scene where he asks, you sure you good? After he gives her all the stuff to go sell, it's that moment where she's kind of quiet and kind of unsure, where I realized she feels like that because he is trying to get rid of the deafness that, like Joe says, they are constantly reminding the community members that is not a thing to get rid of, it's a thing to embrace. It's a thing to almost feel proud of. And it makes that decision that Ruben ends up making even more impactful. To go to the second big scene in the movie that I really liked, it's that closing scene where Ruben is just taking a walk and experiencing the world through his implants. And it's this kind of horrible sounding, garbled environment that he's in. And that's another big ups to the sound design department, because I almost started hearing like Ruben heard through the hearing implant even when it was off, because it constantly jumps back and forth from Ruben's perspective and just from an outside perspective. And each time you hear a car passing by, you almost hear it garbled like Ruben does. And it leaves the viewer in this state where you almost feel like you're deaf too, as silly as it sounds. And that scene where he's sitting there and the church bells are just unbearable, and he takes out his ears basically, and he sits there in silence just looking at people, just interacting with each other and just walking, and he looks at the cars driving by in just complete silence, and he's just kind of sitting there and staring. And that's where the movie ends, and I kind of knew it was going to end right there, just kind of had the instinct. But it was such a emotional moment because the whole movie is Ruben just trying to claw back to that old, hearing state that he was in with Lou. And you can tell, he sold the van and he shaved his head, and Lou was kind of doing her own thing now. And you can tell with their first interaction that it's just never going to be the same. And Ruben is never going to be as happy as he was when he was drumming with Lou. And it's this really soul-crushing, heartbreaking moment when he kind of sits there and realizes, I can't just put on the mask forever. I have to just be who I am. And that's what sticks out in my head in this movie. And that's what I'm probably going to remember from this movie. And I'm not complaining by any means, because it's a great scene to remember. But I really enjoyed this movie. It is not an emotional roller coaster, but it is very emotional. And the acting from Lou and Ruben, especially, or from Olivia Cook and Riz Ahmed, are just outstanding. And from Paul Raci too. I'm not discrediting Paul. They're all three of them. The whole movie cast is great. Everyone does a great job in their performance. just little things like that interaction that Ruben has with the deaf kid on the slide, where he's kind of doing the drums with him. It's just all really great stuff like that adds up to this really great movie overall. But I think I've hit pretty much everything I wanted to. I hope my audio sounds better. I'm using my new mic, my new setup. Please let me know if it's too loud or if it's too quiet. Obviously I can change that. But I hope you enjoyed. Definitely go watch this movie. And I will see you in the theaters.